Hello and welcome to this PASS Virtual Summit 2020 presentation. The topic of today is data modernization, or more precisely, how to run a successful modernization project. My name is Raoul Illyes. I'm the practice director for Lucient. And you can see also there's an acronym there, DPM. That's what we call data modernization internally. So DPM stands for Data Platform Modernization, still the same thing. We're all modernizing data. Before I continue with my presentation, I would like to get a shout out to PASS and all the great things that PASS do for us as a community of professionals. And I would highly recommend that you seek out and gain knowledge about all the different offerings that PASS has, both locally and, as you know, remotely or globally as part of this PASS event. This is just some info about me. Again, Raoul Illyes, work for Lucient, and that's me in the picture right there. All right, so the first thing that we really need to identify when we talk about data modernization is that what would be the reason for the modernization at all? I mean, either from you, a personal perspective, your boss perspective, organization's perspective, a potential client perspective. I mean, there must be a need. And on this screen, there's a lot of different needs here that could be a triggering event for a modernization project. Now, you don't know this because I haven't told you that, but being a practice director now for the DPM for the last 2 years, I've been doing nothing but modernization projects for the globally. And I can share with you my experience that some of these triggers, as they are called, are, from my perspective at least, more common than other. And I would like to say that the most common from our perspective is the software and hardware refresh reasoning for a modernization project. Why? Well, as you might know, typically an organization have a renewal date of the licensing model with Microsoft every 3rd year. And when they come to a renewal phase, if they have a lot of extra installations that are not licensed correctly, or let's say they have a server CAL model and they are in need of acquiring a lot of new CALs for their end users, that could be a substantial cost increase for the company, organization, or the client, and that could definitely be a trigger for a data modernization project, meaning that we need to clean this up, we need to do something different, and we need to be more efficient. And the same goes for hardware refresh. So most organization, companies, and so forth have a write-off of investment in hardware. There's somewhere between 3 to 5 years. And typically, when you do a hardware refresh, you also look at the topology and the applications that you run on top of that hardware, and that will also usually trigger the interest and the need for doing a data modernization. Another group of, well, I group them together, but another thing that's also quite common and has been especially common for the last year is the one at the bottom here, the software end of support. I would group that in with the compliance and also in some partially with the security threats. And as you know, 2008 or 2008 R2 are no longer supported versions of SQL Server by Microsoft. So that has also been an compelling trigger for organizations that had a lot of their total data estate invested in these elder version of SQL Server as a trigger for saying, okay, it's not going to be supported anymore. We bought the extended support. We out of that. We need to do something. And that would trigger a modernization project. Not to say that the other ones are not equally true, but they are less common as an triggering from my experience working with this for the last 2 years. But still, This is the first thing that needs to be identified before we even talk about the data modernization project. Because if we don't have something that will bring value to whoever is the recipient of what we suggest to do, it's very, very hard to get this in motion. Secondly, once we have the trigger identified, we also need to come up with the target platform. So what we have today is not necessarily going to be the same thing that we have tomorrow. So as you know, there's a lot of options out there today for where to run your data workloads. So you might be on-premise today. It might be that you still need to be on-premise, but it could also be that you want to go for the cloud, or you have a requirement to go for the cloud. Or again, based on my experience, which is most common, is that you do a hybrid solution. Typically, there's one to three applications, even though you can migrate 99% of your workloads. Typically, there are some applications that just cannot be migrated to the cloud. And in that sense, you will always, or most commonly, end up with a hybrid solution. Now, again, based on my extensive work for the last 2 years, out of all the DPMs or data modernization projects that I've been involved with, only a single one of them has been an cloud-only migration. And the reason for that was actually quite well defined. This client was placed in the US, and they were on a yearly basis hit very, very hard by the typhoons and the storms and what have you not that happens in that area on a yearly basis. So they had a lot of shortage of power, and they needed to come up with a solution that made them keep them online, even though that their data as of today was physically placed in local data center, and there the public cloud was the perfect match for them. So that's the only one as of today that I've been involved with that has been a cloud only migration. I would say that beside that one scenario, 98% have been hybrid scenarios, and only one or two of these have been an on-premise purely scenario with an equivalent reasonable logic behind why it had to stay on-premise as the one that I have explained for the public cloud. Finally, when you have decided, okay, you have the triggers for doing the modernization project, you know what type of platform you want to go for, still there's a lot of details that need to be in place as well. And that's true even both for an on-premise scenario as well for a cloud scenario. And I try to depict here some of the most common type of technical platforms for running SQL Server workloads moving forward. And if we start with the on-premise part, we have two bare metal solutions. We have the classical SQL Server failover clusters, or we can run SQL Server as the AG scenario, always on, that means, but on a bare metal type of infrastructure. Most common today, I would say, is some type of virtualization beneath the physical hardware. But virtualization in itself is no longer just one entity, one company. There are a multitude of companies, basically ACI providers, that either piggyback their solution on a well-established virtualization platform, or they provide a virtualization stack of their own. But still, SQL Server VM is very valid, still on premise. So that's something that's not going away soon. And then we have the public cloud. And public cloud, we have even more options. We can still run our virtualized workloads in the cloud, as you can see here. That's what we depict as IaaS in the cloud. Azure SQL Server IaaS. Same thing as a virtual server on-prem. Now, the only difference is that that virtual server is now hosted and maintained in the cloud. We also have the more popular, at least recently more popular platforms, and that is the PaaS platform. So in that flavor, we have two entities. We have Azure SQL Database and we have Azure SQL Managed Instance. And then finally, this is just me adding a little extra spice on this picture, but for your specialized workloads, there are also specific targets for that type. And I added an old name here, I can see Azure SQL Data Warehouse. It's today called Azure Synaptics, but still a specific platform, one example of many that exist out in the cloud for that specialized type of workloads. And again, you need to come up with a blueprint, an architecture based on all those different facts that we talked about recently that makes the fulfillment of the triggers from whatever requirement that was made previously. And hopefully, just through these 3 slides, I presented with you the vast majority, or I should say, the big multitude of options that are out there, and it might not always be as easy as it looks. Just looking at this presentation or some other presentation on, how do I actually materialize this? How do I actually go from A to B? And I would say, I would say that under any circumstances, the only way that you can guarantee to be successful with the modernization project is that you have a well-defined process. So what I'm sharing here on this screen is the process that we use within Lucient. There's nothing secret here, but this is just our delivery model. And at least I hope I can inspire you to see the reason and the validity of having a well-defined process before you go ahead with your data modernization project. And the rest of this presentation is basically, we're going to go through the different steps in this process more in depth and why they are important. So hopefully after this session, you will know everything needed to run that project successfully within your organization or at your clients. So to begin with, we have the pre-study. And the goal of the pre-study basically is to answer the first question. The question regarding what is triggering the need for the modernization and what would be the benefits of doing something different. Now, in our delivery model, you can see below here, we have 3 steps. We have something we call the insight part, we have a workshop, and we have a feasibility report. Now, at least for you running this internally in your company, the one thing that you need to be able to answer is the insight part. And that insight part consists of 3 things. First of all, you need to be able to tell precisely what it is that you have. Also, you need to be able to tell how what you have is being used. Finally, you also need to be able to answer what potential platforms would be a good fit for my workload. Basically, the 3 previous slides needs to be answered. Once we have all that data, then we are ready to go to the justification phase. It's in the justification phase, typically you will work with the project manager, because the project manager will keep track of not only to come up with the project plan, but also all the different costs as part of the project that will be delivered. And there will be a cost either in hours or cost in consultants services based on if this is something you do yourself or as part of your own organization, or if you're doing this on the behalf of a client as part of a consultant engagement. And the justification phase is then basically to get the result of the pre-study and answer the question, why do we want to go for that direction? And basically, it's the economics that's going to help us to guide us to the right solution for the company based on the triggers that was defined in the very first page. Once that is done, then we go to the project phase. And in the project phase, it's here where you're actually doing the work. Now we are migrating from A to B. And the B is, of course, the result of what was done at the pre-study and justification phase. Now, I think that the fourth part might be actually the most important one in this whole presentation. Why? Because governance is key, especially when you go for cloud economics. So governance has to do with, let's say you come from a scenario where you have a SQL Server sprawl, meaning that you have a lot of installations. You might be missing some licenses here and there. You make a major investments to clean this up. You might migrate everything to the cloud. Now, it's very, very important for that project not only to pay itself in a 3-year period, but after that 3-year period, we do not want to see another server sprawl again. That's what's meant by governance model. Among other things, now when we talk about cloud economics, the most common understanding of governance is the governance of cost, and that's also the possibility to break up cost. So let's say you have an organization, well, you work within a company that has many different organizations, and every organization is responsible for paying their own cost. Now, with the cloud economics model, also available on-prem, depending on the solution you choose, you can break up the total cost of the spending in the cloud, and you can then slide that bill to the different organizations within your company. So this is key, I would say. Having a well-defined process and follow that process from A to B to make sure that not only you are basing your projects on fact, but also that you can show after the project is done that you have delivered on the promises that you made to the organization, and that you have a strong governance model afterwards. So you make sure that the services that you provide previously are not just as equally good as they were before, but they are even better, and that every dime spent are being tracked afterwards. So let's go a little bit more into details how this looks like then. So as I said, the first part was the pre-study. Another word for that, which probably is more typically used, is the assessment part. So as I already stated, the first part of the 4-process model is basically answer the question, what are the benefits by doing something different? And to be able to answer that questions, there are 3 bullet points which we must provide organization with data. The first one, which I already referred to, was what do we have? Okay, what are our total installation base? Secondly, how it's being used. And finally, which targets are valid per workload? Okay, 3 great questions. How do we manifest this data then? Well, depending on what type of migration we are looking at and also what fits into your organization, there are, as always, a multitude of options. So if you want to do this type of investigations yourself and you want to do it provided using on-premise tools, Microsoft have great freeware tools you can use yourself to manifestate the answers to these 3 questions. Versus to that, Microsoft also have a strong cloud suite available to them, well, available to you, I should say, to be used to, again, get precisely the same type of data. When we talk about on-premise solution, when we talk about getting the data of, or sorry, getting the answers to the questions, what do we have and how it's being used, I would recommend using the Microsoft Map Toolkit, freely downloadable from the Microsoft homepage. It can give you a complete inventory of all your secret installations down to the database level. Yes, all the component services, all the versions, editions, SKUs, everything will be collected. And also, once that has been done, you can also set up the tool to collect utilization data from that precise same environment. So now, once that is done, we have answered two questions. What do we have and how it's being used? Also, a little note here. I would also recommend that if you use or whatever tool you use to collect utilization data, you should at least run it for a minimum of 2 weeks time. Why? Because you want that data to be as statistically sound as possible, right? So if you only collect for a half an hour, you only see the world view of your data state from a half an hour perspective. That's not going to give you a statistical sufficient data to come up with any qualified calculations. If you collect for a minimum of 2 weeks, preferably a month, then that statistical data will be much more valid than just half an hour. Final recommendation regarding that is also that you collect data over a monthly break, because typically when we talk about data estate, again, based on my experience, data is more used, heavily used during monthly breaks, because that's when the company sends their invoicing, do the accounting calculations and so forth. Great. Now there's also another part here, and that is the data migration assistant. That is the tool that's going to help us evaluate different target platforms. So now we know what we have, we know how it's being used, and we also get data on what would be a perfect target platform for my workloads. That is the on-premise stack of tools that we also within Lucient use on a consistent basis. Final note about the data migration assistant. It is fully automable. You can automate it fully through PowerShell, and it's also provided a basic PowerShell script for run a complete automation of DMA from Microsoft. Now, the final part here is that, as I already said, there's also a cloud option from Microsoft, and it's all collected within the Azure Migrate service page. So within that page, basically what's happening in the background is that you will run the discover assessment and the utilization data collections, but now you will be running it from the cloud instead of running it on-prem. And also, there used to be a third-party tool called Mover. It's still a tool called Mover, but what happened, I think it's like 6 months ago, it was acquisition by Microsoft. So that's why I've added here, because now it's linked into the Azure Migrate service portal, but there are some licensing needs, specific licensing needs for running that tool. So that's why I still have separated it here. Great. So now we have the insight. That is all the data that we need. Now, how could some of that insight then manifest, and why is it so important? Well, I think that this picture here tells more than a million words, basically. So this is the result, the way that we aggregated it within our company to present potential target platforms. So, I mean, it's one thing to have a goal to go for something, but it might not be feasible from a technical perspective. So within this screenshot, basically you see the evaluation of running whatever on-premise workloads that this depicts, and we can see the complexity of upgrading that to a different platform. So the first top bar here is that if we were to migrate this workload to SQL Server 2019, I can see on the coloring scheme that the number of errors would be very few. And errors in this scenario means things that must be fixed or changed before I upgrade or migrate this specific workload to this platform. Yes. And then we have the orange, which is a warning. That is information that could be a problem. Well, basically it depicts a feature that has been marked as it's going to be removed in the future, but it has not materialized yet. So that is something that you need to be aware of. But from this picture perspective, it's the red bar that we want to focus on. So very few errors within the SQL Server 2019. The same goes when we look for 2017, SQL Server 2017. And also true when we look for the managed SQL Server or the managed instance in Azure. Very few errors keeping us from migrating these types of workloads to that platform. Now, there's a huge difference between managed instance and Azure SQL Database. Even though they're both PaaS, you can see that the red bar for Azure SQL Database is huge. This in itself tells us that for our complete total data estate, this is not a good idea, right? Not to say that individual workloads or individual databases wouldn't be a perfect fit for that type of platform, but for our data estate as a whole, probably not a good idea. And again, this is the value of data. This is why it's so important that we do our homework before we start the project itself. This is another screenshot for some of the data that you can get out of the map toolkit. Again, it's our visualization of the data, but the data is still the same. So here we have a clear picture in the top here of the difference of number of components and SQL instances and the number of hosts that is part of this collection set. Now, another metadata that's also very important that you need to collect as part of your process and part of your project is the qualification of the environments within the organization. So you can see here that we have added a metadata tag, divided the environment between test and production. Now, why is that important? Very, very important, both from an on-premise and a cloud perspective, when we talk about what type of licenses are needed to be bought as part of this migration project, or from a cloud perspective, what type of subscription we would choose depending on the environment classification. You can also see here, I have a clear picture of what versions of SQL Service do I have. And as I mentioned previously, there's an end of support for 2008. And in this circumstance, I actually have a single instance on 2008. So that is something that I must fix from a compliance perspective, right? Also, I can see the numbers of SKU here. I have two installations running SQL Server Enterprise. I have 7 running SQL Server Standard. I have 2 Business Intelligence installations, and I have 10 instances running SQL Server Express. And I have the same of the different component services of SQL Server. Now, the bottom category is quite interesting. And that is why I mentioned the SKUs of the instances running SQL Server. As I stated before, here in the top, we have 2 enterprise editions of SQL Server. We also have 7 standard edition of SQL Server. Now, if I want to upgrade this to anything newer than 2016 SP2, I know for a fact that one of the hardcore boundaries between when it's a good, from a technical perspective, I should say, from when I must go for enterprise edition versus standard edition is the memory limit. So one of the hard cap memory limits are 120 gigabytes of memory. Now, that is why this bottom bar is also interesting. And we can see here that actually I only have a single instance that is configured with 128 gigabytes of ROM. And not a single instance or a single VM has more than 128 gigabytes of ROM allocated to it. Now, once I take this and apply the utilization data that I also collected, I can very easily and fairly quickly tell already from this insight if I should evaluate to downgrade these enterprise editions licenses to standard edition, for example, instead. Again, one of the key points why it's so important that you have your metadata collected and your metadata in check before you start doing anything. And finally, here's an example of the utilization perspective. This is divided into three different categories. We have CPU utilization, we have memory utilization, and we have disk utilization or disk allocation. And I would say that CPU utilization is one of the key things that we focus on because, as you know, or hopefully know, or if you don't know, then I'm going to tell you that when it comes to SQL Server, it's usually, it's almost always core based, meaning that if you want to physically license your, if you want to license your physical hardware, that is only enterprises, enterprise core licenses. If you want to use standard edition core licensing model, that's only possible for the VM itself. And there's a minimum, it's true also for the enterprise, a minimum of 4 core licenses per VM. Or you can go with the server CAL model, but that is being removed by Microsoft. So that is an old model, but if you come for that model, it's still valid for your on-prem environment. So with this picture, you can see that the total allocated core for this specific scenario is 107, but once we apply, again, the utilization data that we collected for this environment, we can see that even though we look at the peak utilization, the highest numbers, only 25 out of those 107 cores were used in total for this environment. That means that from a licensing perspective, there's a huge potential for big savings, big gains from a client perspective. Same goes for memory utilization. It's not allocated to licensing, but it's very, very important when you do your final calculations, both true for an on-premise as well as a cloud scenario. And then we have the disk allocation. I would say the disk allocation is mostly of interest when you have outsourced your IT operation and you're basically paying for storage per gigabyte. If you have a big discourse between allocated and actually used, that could also be a catalyst to some very easy, quick, big fix savings for you as a client by trying to elevate the allocated value to the disk use-based value. All right. 3 good examples of why it's so important that we have the insight under control. So now we have done our assessment, we have all the data, then we jump for the justification phase. And the part of the justification phase is basically, and here you're going to work with the project manager typically, and that is, okay, we come up with the direction, we have all the data, we know which platforms are a good potential or not, we know what type of savings that can be made, and we also know the utilization patterns for our workloads. Now, why would we want to prefer one direction over another? That is the justification phase. And the question that we need to answer under this phase is that what direction and what cost? Here we're going to talk a little bit about CAPEX and OPEX. I'm going to go more into detail what that means later on, but it's very important also for you as a technician that you have an overview understanding of these terms, because this is typically business terms that the project manager is going to present to whatever steering group that is running the show above. Which application is connecting to what? So far, we only be focusing on the data, but the data in itself is not really valuable if the connection endpoints from all the application that's connecting to that data is also under our control. So that needs to be evaluated and identified as well. And finally, which resources will be involved in the ongoing project. And when I talk about resources, I'm not talking about infrastructure or data resources. I'm talking about you, the people that's going to be involved within the ongoing project. So how do we do that? Well, this is the same picture that I showed you before. And as part of your assessment stage, probably you came up with a couple of options based on the data from the assessment stage that says we want to do something like a combo of A, B, and C, and whatever A, B, and C is going to be, that's going to fit your narrative within your organization. Here is where CAPEX and OPEX come into the picture and why it's so important. CAPEX stands for capital expense. OPEX stands for operational expense. So CAPEX is everything that you have to pay, but typically pay once. So if you're going for an on-premise solution, a typical example of a CAPEX would be new infrastructure or new licenses that you need to buy, but also, and that is typically forgotten, especially by vendors that don't want to enlighten that, but the project itself, the project that comes after the justification phase, that needs to be added as well. So what I'm trying to depict here, you can see that each and every platform have a different staple regarding CAPEX, is that some migrations or some platforms will require more work to migrate to than others. And that needs to be calculated. The operational expense, that is the ongoing expense for that specific environment. So for example, operations, meaning whatever DBA team, service team that needs to support the environment on an ongoing basis. If you're going for cloud, the cloud cost is going to be part of that OPEX total cost of ownership. That is OPEX. And that is why it's so important, again, to have those two entities, understand these two concepts, and also how they manifest themselves depending on which platform we choose. And you can see also in this graph that it's highly dependent, again, on which type of platform we talk about. Now, the second part is, how do we identify connection endpoints? And there's really no answer. Well, it's not as easy as it is with the assessment data. There's a boundless amount of third-party software you can use to collect all these connection endpoints. We ourselves have our own tool that we use, but there are plenty of third-party software available. Again, with the Movere tool, it will provide you that data, but then you have to do cloud collection, and that's part of, as I stated before, the Azure Migrate Suite, but it probably will introduce an extra cost for you and your organization using that tool. But it's a great tool, and it will help you manifest your connection endpoints, because again, moving the data to a new location without changing the connection endpoints of your application, or migrating your application as part of that migration, if it's, for example, to the cloud, will be a disaster for a project. Again, that's why it's so important that we have a well-defined process so we don't forget anything. And finally, we also need to define who is going to be part of this project. And this is again an example of what we typically see when we talk to our clients, and this could also be very typical for you. Maybe it's only going to be internal resources doing the project itself and working with the project manager. It could also be that you're working with the partner, and in this type of scenario, a partner for me and my experience is typically, let's say, as I said before, you might be using an outsourcing partner. That is type of partner that I'm talking about. Will the outsourcing partner be needed as part of the migration? And finally, you might also need consultants, either for mentoring or training you in new technology, or there might be some specific tasks that only some very specialized consultant can help you with. So this is the typical scenario that we see out there. Now, third, since we now have all the things in the project defined, and the project manager had come up with the project plan, working with team, and come up with all the cost, and you together, based on the cost, had defined which the final platforms for your migration is going to be, we need to run the project. And as stated before, the project is that, yes, we are manifesting the results of our efforts. Now, there are two things that is very important to have part of your project, based on our experience, is a well-defined scope of what tools is going to be involved for running that project, and also, equally important, what deliverables will be made available to the organization as part of that project, as part of the migration itself. Now, when we talk about tools, again, there's tons of tools out there, but typically these are the most common ones. On the left side is from an on-premise scenario, and on the right side is the cloud migration scenario. If you're doing an on-prem migration, typically, especially if we're talking about the bare metal scenarios, or I would say any scenario, you will use PowerShell. In some way, form, or another, PowerShell will be involved in your migration scenario. And when it comes to PowerShell, there's a lot of community tools out there. One of them is the one that I've added here, the DBA tools. That's different PowerShell modules that will make that migration, that transformation much more easily working with PowerShell module and commandlets than you doing that migration manually yourself. Now, the only scenario where PowerShell might not be as oftenly or heavily used is when you are coming from a virtual environment. If you're coming from a virtual environment, or you're going to a virtual environment for your on-premise solution, typically you're going to use that virtualization platform toolset that comes with that virtualization platform. So if we are talking VMware or Microsoft Hyper-V, doesn't really matter. Every platform has their own tool sets for making that migration as seamless as possible. When we come to the cloud side, depending on which platform you're going for, again, basically there are two main platforms. We have the PaaS and we have the IaaS. The IaaS is the VM running in Azure. The PaaS is the platform as a service. So that's either Azure SQL database or managed instance. And when we talk about PaaS, that is what we see in the top. Typically, when we migrate to PaaS, we're going to use the database migration service. That is a Microsoft Azure offering for migrating individual databases, right? Now, if we're doing a lift and shift, meaning that we are migrating from on-prem, typically VMs, to Azure VMs, that's a lift and shift, then again, we have the Azure site migration, or Azure Migration Suite that can assist us with that process. So again, it's very important that we have the right set of tools for the right type of workloads and the right type of target that we're going to migrate to. Finally, all too common thing to forget is that our experience is that also to be able to run a successful migration project, we need to deliver valuable data to the organization as we migrate. And this is just a couple of examples. This is no rocket science that we deliver as part of our project. And on the left side, basically, we have a lot of statistics on the existing environment. But on the right side, we have a summary of all those statistics. And basically, we can provide to the organization, whoever is the owner of that specific application, you know, how did your application behave and perform before we did the migration, and how did it behave and perform after the migration? And again, we want the application owners or whoever is the owner of that specific workload to be our ambassadors. And we, of course, want for them as well for ourselves that the migration is going to be seen as a success. And from our perspective as technicians, the best way to show success is through data, but try to visualize them in a way that it can be easily understood for anyone. And in this very example, you can see that before we did the migration of an application, we had some warnings regarding I/O latency. After we did the migrations, that is no longer the case. Again, something that is very appreciative within the organization, and it creates a lot of value for the migration project itself, and it's something that I would highly recommend that you adopt as part of your migration project as well. Finally, the governance part. So we also need to maintain our investment. And the question that we need to be answering is something that I mentioned before. Are we protected from future server sprawl? Meaning that we clean everything up. Now we need to make sure that we are making savings on our investments. Also, do we live up to the SLA that we have promised the organization? And finally, are costs divided between different cost centers? So when it comes to server sprawl or whatever type of technical SLAs, anything regarding the technical platform and the deliveries of that technical platform, we have an experience that is very valuable that you provide the organization with the dashboard that can give them insights into that data directly. So what I added on this screen is a tool that we use internally to provide that type of data. And it's very much similar to what you would see in Azure Cloud regarding you have different tiles providing you with different type of data. But in this very scenario, we can see we have two different SQL servers and they are missing updates, meaning that either service packs or cumulative updates are not in place, and that could be a breach of SLA. We can also see that we are missing some backups here. Maybe we are breaching SLAs in regards to our backup strategy. This needs to be under control. Now, there's also another very important part, especially when we talk about cloud and SLA, and that is we need to understand in depth the platform that we are migrating to. So this is a common poster from Microsoft showing the protection of data as it's being provided by Azure. And you can see here in the blue bar, we have something called a geo application. And it's also said that, you know, data is going to be global available in 54 regions. Now, the key thing that's very important for us as technicians to understand, when we talk about geo application and we talk about regions, the only form of protection that we can get out of that is asynchronous protection. In essence, what it means is that if we need to do a failover from one region to another, we will lose data, period. We will not know how much data we're going to lose, but we will lose data because it's asynchronous replication. Now you can see here, I added a red dotted line here with an arrow and says AC, AC, AC. What do I mean by that? Well, that is something that we need to understand as technicians when we migrate our workloads. Because as you can see here, everything in Azure is coupled in what's called an Azure region pair. So for example, you will always have a primary region and a secondary region. And you can see here that the list that I've copied is that in the top north central US, its secondary region is going to be south central US. That means that if I set the workload on region 1 and I set it up for year replication to region 2, if there's a breach in region 1 and my data have to go, has to switch over to the second region, I'm going to lose data. That's not good enough for my SLA. Well, that is why Microsoft implemented what it called AC or availability zones. So the problem with the regions is that part of the protection that a region pair will have to be at least 300 miles apart. And that gives us a problem when it comes to the physics or the law of physics, because everything here is, we are talking about the speed of light, and 300 miles is long enough a distance that we will not be able to run synchronous replication of our data. And that is the reason why we will lose data in a failover scenario. That's why Microsoft implemented the AC scenario, availability zones. What does that mean? So within a region, you will, as a minimum, have 3 independent linked data centers within that region. And depending on the type of platform that you have chosen to put your data into, either if it's IaaS or it's a PaaS platform, you have the option to configure it to use ACs instead of using regional pairs as a protection mechanism. And with ACs, you have that full synchronous replication, meaning that if one of these data centers goes down within a region or an AC set, your data will be protected. You will not lose any data. It will be manifested or go live in another data center within the AC set. Very, very important to know these type of things before you start doing migration, especially when you go for the cloud. Finally, is around cost. As I said, there's a lot of things you can do. If you want to do it on-prem, there are third-party softwares. If you're running virtualized environments, I would say that most of the virtualization platforms provide some type of cost calculation that you can use as part of them. If you're using a bare metal solution, there are third-party software, or you have to build it yourself. It's not impossible. You could, well, I'm saying easily, but you could quite easily manifest that through something like collecting extended events data out of your SQL instances. But when we talk about the cloud, everything is provided for you by Microsoft. And here is where the type of subscriptions comes into place and why it's so important to have a basic understanding of subscriptions. Because one of the common faults that we see is that customers just lift and shift, throws everything into a single subscription, and they haven't done the work needed to classify the workloads. And in the very beginning, I said that we put a metadata tag to production and non-production workloads. And this is especially important when you want to go for Azure, because you have different subscription types for the type of workload. Meaning that if you go for a test development subscription type, the cost that you pay for running those type of workloads within Azure is going to be much more less than if you are running live production. Again, we can also use different subscription as a way to diversify the cost within different organization. But regarding organizational cost, that can also be done on a more fine-grained level using resource groups, differentiation, and so forth within Azure. But at least keep this in mind. When we talk about subscription, make sure you have the right type of subscription for that type of workload. All right, we went through the whole process. Now, the final part, and this should be the first part before you even start planning anything, is that, okay, we have different triggers, but what are the goals that we're going to set up for the project for us to be able to see and tell if this was a success or not. Now, from our experience, the typical number one reason that somebody wants to do anything regarding data modernization has to do with cost. And cost is typically calculated regarding licensing cost, operations cost, or infrastructure cost. And our track record, again, this is just something that you can use as a baseline, but our track record for savings within these three cost centers are about 60%. So that is the potential out there. And this is probably the potential also within your organization. And you can just ask your licensed assets manager on how much a reduction about 60% would be in dollars or whatever currency that you use. And you will see a happy smiley face back if you can give them these type of promises. Operations, same thing, 35%. The focus here is, people, IT, and business processes. So when we talk about people, this is not about making people out of a job. It's more about the people that we have. They need to provide value to the business. So any tedious task that creates manual repetitive task that doesn't really create any value whatsoever, that is what we mean about efficiency regarding operations. And again, we have a track record here. You can use that as also as a baseline. It's around 35% more efficiency regarding operations. Agility is another part. We need to work faster. The time when it took 1 week to 3 months before we got a VM, once we ordered it through the ITIL process, that is time of the past. Once we order something and something has improved, it has to be materialized very, very quickly. Here, cloud is a great way to make that shift happen. Our track record, our baseline here is around 40%. And then finally, we have compliance and insight. Now, compliance is that we don't want to have any legacy left whatsoever. It might be that we need to keep something for a year or two before it's getting put in the junkyard, so to speak, or in the crap department. But everything needs to be cleaned out. No more 2008 versions, no legacy data, no old security holes or bad HRDR solutions. Everything needs to be in place. Our baseline here is around 30%. You can use that as well. And finally, the insight part. And the reason why we have said 95% improvement here is because when we come about collecting usage data for an entire data estate, I could easily put 99% here because our track record is that no one so far have been able to give us those data. Now, if you do this correctly and you implement, as I've given you a couple of examples before, this will never be the situation again. You will always be able, also in the future, to be able to tell the organization precisely what you have, how it's being used, and which platforms it's being utilized. All right, that was my session. Thank you very much. Please visit the session evaluation, fill it out. It's very important that we get feedback. Thank you very much. Final slide here is my contact information if it should be any questions. I should also be available for Q&A, so hopefully I will talk to you live as well. Thank you very much. Have a good day.